I'm Robert Fishman. I'll be moderating this panel. And I want to thank all three of our speakers for such a wonderful beginning to this conference. And I want to begin our discussion by praising Robert Moses. And yeah, I mean, of course, Moses is the arch villain of 20th century American urbanism. But I think he had one quality we might learn from, and that is he understood power. And he understood the importance of a strategic intervention. For example, he understood how important it was in the vast metropolitan area of New York to control the flow of tolls from one bridge, the Triborough Bridge and the Triborough Bridge Authority. And on that seemingly minor base, that becomes his lever to move the whole of the greatest metropolitan region in the world. So from that somewhat limited, I mean, what he did with it is another matter, but I'd like to challenge our panelists, starting, in the order that they spoke, in terms of, we've heard such wonderful ideas, in terms of teasing out what they would consider to be a strategic intervention. For example, Teddy, I was fascinated by the way you zeroed in, as I think correctly, on our first-string suburbs, on what Dolores Hayden called the sitcom suburbs, that were designed so overwhelmingly designed for the single-family house, for the older idea of the neighborhood, of the housewife, and so on. I think you're absolutely right that this is an area where we're ready. We can imagine the whole metropolitan region changing fundamentally. So, how would you, in other words, to challenge you, what is the strategic intervention that that could, transform these places that were designed for a completely different life?
I guess I didn't do a good job in summarizing that. I was maybe rushing too much, but clearly what I was trying to say is that already that has been transformed. And that is not by architects, but it's in fact by immigrants as they have begun to retrofit much of those environments into more operative conditions, suggesting that behind those illegal, non-conforming patterns of density and economy is really a more strategic, fundamental, let's say, unpacking or redefinition of land use as we know it. Other categories of zoning, other categories of the aesthetic, other categories of the economic. And in that sense, it's about Moses, but I would say it's about Moses and Jacobs, because that's what really continues to be polarized. I think that we continue to polarize and we are unable to really work with new problematizing of global and local, of large and small, of formal and informal, of top-down and bottom-up. And I think there is a lot to say about the need to really operate within that space of that in the midst of that antagonism. So I'm thinking again that what I was suggesting is that the point of departure to get to that strategic is to understand the tactical, just as a moment of beginning. I realize that my presentation focuses a lot on the local and the local and the local, and that's very dangerous in academic settings because this seems to be provincial. But what I was trying to say is that, in essence, is that by beginning small, at least in my context, we also begin to reimagine the region. Because as planners, we continue to operate in a hugely abstract space. It's only when conflict hits the ground and when that alteration happens tactically, suggesting the transformation of those parcels into other systems, when we begin to imagine the region at other scales.
Okay, yeah. If I could just follow up, follow up on that.
Sorry, it's just
it's a wonderful response. How would you, in other words, thinking of yourself now, narrowly, if that's the word, as an urban designer, what is the intervention that you would want to make as, in other words, I think you're absolutely right. A transformation is already occurring. and what we're trying to do is to build on it.
Yes.
Now, what do you add, or what would you like to add that isn't there now?
Again, I did a bad job in explaining that, but I think that ultimately, in my case, was to realize that the first gesture is not building, that it is really about entering into a particular condition, which in this case is the politics and economics and the kind of social configurations of a neighborhood, to get very specific and to suggest that we could design particular political frameworks. I did not have time to explain it, but the nonprofit organizations that I've been working with in San Diego particularly act as translators, and they're representatives that translate some of those very interesting dynamics into particular policies. It is not about what we represent, but about who we represent. Yeah. And so these people who are immigrants are in fact the new citizens, because they are performatically constructing the new urbanism, not the traditional new urbanism, sorry, which I have a distaste for. But the issue is having to do with an act of translation of those dynamics, setting up a very different political framework of partnership and of economic sustainability by completely redefining tax credit-based subsidy development into smaller pieces that are prepackaged by these, again, partnerships within nonprofits, city government, and community representatives. It's a whole retrofitting of political and economic systems that then inspire particular spatial practice. And that's the reason I was suggesting that in my case, it's really about the parcel in the way of producing the maximum amount of socioeconomic exchanges per acre, I was suggesting, by injecting infrastructures that can support the informal. Imagine at a moment when even the most progressive administration that we've had in years is beginning to suggest that infrastructure is only about freeway building and bridge building. We need to reconceptualize even the meaning of infrastructure. And in essence, what I'm trying to say is that it is an infrastructure that is strategic, hopefully, in the way that it absorbs the tactical, in the way that it absorbs and supports these informal economies and densities.
Okay, well, thank you. And certainly, if the other members of the panel wish, have comments on this, otherwise I'll go on to Jonathan. Okay.
I was just going to suggest that one of the things that we might do is not add something, but take away something, and that is some of our current regulations. I mean, they restrict so much a lot of informal activity, a lot of really productive activity, and I think what Jonathan pointed out is that they also keep us farther apart from where we need to go.
That's precisely the problem definition that I would endorse. And then the question I'd like to try and answer is, what would be the steps? How can we get from here to there? If we have this entrenched tradition of exclusive and low-density zoning, that 2/3 of which is in the single-family zone that dominates our metropolitan areas, how do we begin to alter this institution? I think we can think of a small, medium, and large, mini, midi, and maxi approach to policy reform. I think the mini approach is what's going on already. And it's a process of education and even call it technology transfer. Municipalities are learning one from another that one can reform traditional zoning, one can allow greater density, one can allow mixed use, and no great disaster happens. In fact, some fairly remarkable things have happened as a consequence. The process of education is also a process of transformation of the urban planning profession. A few years ago, I looked back at my very first urban planning textbook, which was published in 1976. I used it as an undergrad, and it said quite a matter of fact, it wasn't even a matter of values, about land uses ought to be strictly separated. We were taught that way in the 1970s. Well, I don't think the newer generations of urban planners are being taught that way. So there is a generational change that I am optimistic ultimately will have effect. The MIDI version, the medium version of policy reform, I think the medium version has to do with changing incentive structures. To illustrate, I'd like to give my personal favorite example on this one, and that is a policy that the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, BART, operates vis-a-vis local municipalities in the San Francisco Bay Area, most of which would love to have a BART station in their borders. And BART says to these municipalities, oh, you want to get the next BART extension, do you? Well, let's check your land use regulations. Oh no, look at this. You're zoning for low density, for single family, for land use separation in the areas that might otherwise be appropriate for a BART station. Effectively, what this second level does is says, you know, you municipalities, you still have your prerogatives. You can do what you want to do. But we, regional agencies, and BART is in fact a regional agencies, also have our prerogatives, and we're not going to waste our transit money if you won't alter your zoning properly. And there's a number of examples like this where higher level agencies act to change the incentives of lower level agencies. I think the third level is the toughest nut to crack, and that's power sharing between local and regional. So that's what I call the maxi version of the reform. Myron Orfield has shown us one way, and that is the idea that the inner ring suburbs can form a coalition with the city because, in fact, their fates are much more linked. The fates of the inner ring suburb are much more linked with that of the city than with that of the outer ring suburbs. So they misperceive where they are in the municipal hierarchy. That can form a politically transformative coalition. Another approach is the approach of Gerald Frug, who advocates the creation of regional authorities whereby you can get things done, but only if you, the municipalities, can agree upon what you're going to do. In other words, creating a vessel of a regional authority that is actually quite powerful if and only if the municipalities, democratically represented, are able to act within them. And the third possibility, the third form of this maxi version, I want to identify with our own alumna, Sonia Hurt, alumna of our program, who identifies a very significant difference in practice between US zoning codes and European zoning codes. There's such a thing as a single-family zone in the US, and there's such a thing as a single-family zone in Germany. These are two entirely different creatures, because the single-family zone in Germany and much of Europe includes by right single-family houses and all ancillary uses. A grocery store is a use by right in a single-family zone. An accessory dwelling unit is a use by right in a single-family zone. So as opposed to creating little mini mixed-use zones at the centers of our town, one can imagine more fundamental reform with statewide enabling legislation by which one could, with a stroke of a pen, change the definition of the land use regulations that govern 2/3 of our metropolitan areas. Also a political tough nut to crack.
So can I say something?
Yes,
While
please,
we
please.
wait for that change of that statewide legislature, because at this current climate, it seems very distant. What do we do in the meantime? I'm wondering, always wondering how the stimulus package should have been accompanied by a creativity stimulus.
Yeah.
Part of the effort here is how do we encroach into the rigidity and at times the stupidity of institutions. And sometimes I think, in this case, at least I'm suggesting, as this aspiration or the dreaming today of these sessions, that while that change happens, I think neighborhoods can become the laboratories. Not municipalities maybe in the beginning, but very smart, progressive, non-profit, community-based organizations that are really producing interesting policies and very interesting interface with publics. So the neighborhood could be a developer of its own housing stock. The city has been defined, as I had been mentioning, in terms of its very specific, rigid politics and economics of developments that we as architects were decorating for the last 12 years or so. As everybody was rushing to Dubai and China, the most amazing projects in terms of this interface between the large and the small, the formal and the informal, etc., top down and bottom up, was happening in Latin America. Amazing mayors, leaders and visionary mayors that were working, whether in Porto Alegre, De Souza, who began to produce a very interesting policy, called participatory budget, where a community had a voice in distributing the municipal resources, or the stories that you all know of Curitiba with Jamie Lerner, which, by the way, the story has not been translated in the way that it should, how that mutated to Colombia, where Sergio Fajardo in Medellin begins to reconceptualize public space as a hybrid of knowledge and other transformations of the informal. So these are the places, in fact, the only place in the world, I would say, where governments, entire governments, were looking at social networks and informal dynamics as the devices to rethink urbanization. So, but they were really playing a kind of, for me, essential aspect that at this very moment, where our institutions transform in the kind of aspiration that you are suggesting, what is missing at this very moment when the public option has disappeared in front of our very eyes is that there is a huge divide, I think, between the public and our cultural institutions. What drove the most amazing progressive projects in Latin America was an aspirations for social justice as guided by these visionaries to reconnect, I think, collective imagination with public policy. That's the space of operation, which I think it has to do with urban pedagogy, with a complete redefinition of our institutions in these approaches. So at this moment, I'm a fatalistic person, thinking that government in this moment, even if we have a very amazing moment, while that is essential to really manifest, particularly in California, where I'm coming from, where I'm about to lose my job at UCSD, the emphatic assertion that the public needs to be inserted everywhere. But while we get there, we could begin small, I think, at least in my case, working within the very politics and economics of a neighborhood.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Michael a question, I think along lines that Teddy was suggesting. And I was very struck by your beautiful images of the public spaces. Especially Millennium Park, which is, again, a favorite, I think one of the great achievements of urban design. And one of the things that we've learned, I think, is, how to do, or how to aspire to a Millennium Park. At the same time, I think we have to agree that the same period where urban design was, as it were, mastering or remastering the public space has also been a time of increasing inequality in our society, of urban bankruptcy in many ways, the failure of our schools, of our urban school systems, or the crisis of them. So many of the real indicators are in effect going in the other direction. And it makes me wonder where, what's the reality, or what's the deeper reality in terms of social justice of a place like Millennium Park. I mean, maybe there's an aesthetic argument for creating a place that's actually, shall we say, masks the reality. I mean, I'm at once drawn to the place and repelled by it.
Right, exactly. Well, because no one intervention can solve these complex problems, if you will. So the master stroke of Millennium Park is it's a great public space, but it's also had a great impact on real estate values anywhere near it. So the price goes up. And so when you do that, I think this is another policy question. And, well, I guess it's just policy because developers aren't going to do what they don't have to. So you have to implement along with that, or with transit, inclusionary zoning, so that you can guarantee that there's affordable housing somewhere near. And what's interesting is every time we talk about mixed income neighborhoods, we focus on bringing middle class people into poor neighborhoods. And that's the bulk, that's 95% of the discussion. We rarely embrace the idea of carving out pieces of well-to-do neighborhoods and adding some poor people where those amenities already exist. So the spaces are great, but access to them is still a question.
Michael, you indicate that developers aren't going to do what they don't have to do, which is true, yet, well, in the New York Times, a couple days ago, there was a story that I enjoyed about in the city that has the $1,000 omelet, there's also the 99-cent pizza slice. Mm-hmm. And here's what I learned from that the private sector really does a remarkable job, can do a remarkable job of supplying a very, very broad range of markets. Mm-hmm. And when I ask the question, when it comes to land use and when it comes to housing, why is it so systematically bad? And I've got to come to part of the answer has got to be, we have met the enemy and he is us. we regulate land use in a way that that specifically excludes this kind of broad range that the markets seem to be so adept in other areas of producing.
And I contend that you get a much richer mix the closer you are to city centers. That's not saying that we're all going to live there. So one of our challenges is mixing it up in other places as well.
No, I mean, just if I can add, I mean, my aspiration is that we fragment Millennium Park into smaller pieces that are, are retrofitted into neighborhoods of marginality. I mean, I think that it's great to aspire to that, and it's great that it happened. But I think that we need to reconceive also what public space means.
Yes.
And there are so many other categories in that sense. I'm wondering how that is programmed differently also. It's not this image, but it's really the operative dimension of public space.
And I don't think it's perfect. And I think one of the points that I made is that we need public spaces of different types, of different scales, and we need them to be equitably distributed, and we need to maximize every public space that we have. So parks and plazas are one sort of public space, but we have sidewalks, we have intersections, we have public space that is even created on private property by the ways that land is developed. There are ways to contribute to the public realm, which is that place where we have the greatest opportunity to run into people that are different than we are. There are so many types.
And in a sense also, I'm interested in the economy, the cultural economy of public space, because we continue thinking of it as just an exercise of beautification, which is my disagreement with new urbanism. Particularly in some, not to give, again, in a pretentious way, an example of this small parcel, but the amazing advancement that occurred when we inserted a collective kitchen beneath that loggia, that frame that we charge with electricity to be the repository of this series of programmings by the nonprofit. From a family that is interested in leasing that industrial kitchen to produce a small business that can really suggest that the people who live in this neighborhood or in this particular housing type are co-owners of the resources, not just generic customers. So as long as we do not change the nature of a pro forma, the developer's pro forma, and the kind of bottom line, I think we are going to perpetuate development in the way that has defined the terms. So I think public space can be also an economic engine for a community in that sense.
Well, I agree with you that community development corporations, NGOs, are the most powerful tool and agent in neighborhoods right now for creating that kind of equity. They have the power to acquire property. They have the access to resources to develop it. They have a commitment to the communities in which they reside or that they serve, and more often than not, they're accountable to members of the community. It's not always right, because sometimes they serve a very small part of the community and a very special part of the community, but that's where there's so much potential for creativity. That's where you see resident investment in a neighborhood development, where you get renters who are able to participate even in the governance of the governance and maintenance and futures of the places where they live, or to participate in the profits that might be gleaned from developing the commercial properties as well.
The most amazing conflict that I didn't have time to elaborate in San Diego was to realize that in the last 10 years of development of luxury condos everywhere, not one single affordable housing project had been built in many of these depressed neighborhoods. And I realized that it was because of a collision or a conflict between lending and land use. For developers to be competitive in getting tax credits, the development had to be 50 units in density. 50 units in density is prohibited in many of these neighborhoods.
Right.
So tax credit packages or tax credit-based development benefits large development, which in San Diego and some of these transitional zones is impossible. So if we don't break apart the logics of tax credits and the land use that can support this other alternative, is again perpetuating the status quo. So I think the fundamental restructuring of the economic frameworks and the political frameworks that suggest housing is really what is at stake here. And I think, and this is really my position, designers can be participating of that restructuring, reconceptualizing those relations.
Yeah. I'd like to just introduce a big topic that will, I think, continue throughout the conference. In turn, not just the future of urbanism, but in a sense, the more immediate future of urbanism, which will probably, sad to say, be under the influence of the economic catastrophe that, so many, when you think about urban design, it seems almost inherently optimistic, at least in its methods. You start with a neighborhood and then, intervene with hundreds of millions of new building. And I think it's likely that building is going to slow, especially at the edge, perhaps, throughout. And I would just kind of challenge the panel, have you rethought your ideas and your ideals in terms of the reality that seems to be upon us?
It's a good time to buy real estate.
Well, in reality, it's a good time to become a developer. I mean,
Yes.
exactly. And I think that we could be empowering ourselves to produce, again, very different performance, very different collaborations, synergies in neighborhoods, very different economies, I think, will emerge from these communities. So this is a time to really, we have the voice to really say that. It's exactly right. And I think, again, the beginning might not be with buildings, but with producing the fertile ground, which is political and economic, to really produce experimental architecture. I've been so disappointed with my own field that the most avant-garde kind of groups have really perpetuated the problem of just camouflaging those systems of power. I think that we could reclaim at this very moment a different position, and that has to do with encroaching into these institutions. And some people say, well, that sounds like you want to be a politician, not an architect. Well, it's not that. It's that we need to really construct the political. And in that sense, it's really a course of action that is fundamentally different to what we've really had in the last years.
In my observation, the impulse of localist planning to exclude is an unbelievably consistent impulse. It's consistent between localist Republicans and localist Democrats, and localist conservative and localist liberals. It's consistent between boom times and bust times. It's the lodestone of American planning. It's the Rock of Gibraltar. So no, Robert, I haven't changed.
Okay, well,
as I saw Nancy Pelosi on the TV before coming here, I remember listening to her at the Regional Planning Association meeting in New York, and she gave an amazing speech, and she suggested that we also need to change our language. She said that at this moment, to really pass legislation in Congress, we needed to be a lot more assertive in co-opting, in fact, the strategies of the enemy. She said, let's remind everyone when we talk about investing in public infrastructure or transportation infrastructure, that the civil rights movement in this country began in a bus.
That's right.
Let's reassess, again, the kind of conditions that a past has really allowed us to articulate. So I think there is a lot to harvest from that past at this very moment. And the changing of the language, I think, is important, primarily when everything is being hijacked out there, having to do with the public.
I think times of scarcity are when we get our most creative and really get innovative. It promotes innovation, and everybody's trying to think of different ways around the same old problems and some new problems. So it is a unique opportunity because there's not so much competition for building up this other stuff. Yeah. And if we can leverage our partners, which are largely communities, stakeholders, and other designers, there is this space to innovate, and we have that opportunity now.
If I might answer my own question, or just underline what you both said, that I think we now understand the whole boom and crash as a massive misallocation of capital, essentially towards building sprawl that nobody wanted. And we're not going to build much of that in the next 10 years. I think I think the system really has collapsed, and either we go into a prolonged recession, or there will be the kind of infrastructure investment that will lift us out of it. And I think one of our tasks, for the future of urbanism, is to inspire not just the people in this room, but the whole society with what this kind of investment can accomplish. But that's another panel, or other panel. So I just want to thank the group again for 3 wonderful presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.